Welcome to Making the Grade, the podcast that explores what's driving the decline in graduation rates between funding rounds and what it really takes to scale a venture-backed software startup successfully with realistic options to exit. I'm Tom Glasson, CEO at Scalewise, and each week I'm going to be joined by founders, investors, and some of the best go-to-market leaders in the world to unpack the strategies, the missteps, and the mindset shifts that separate those who graduate from those who don't. Expect real talk, actionable go-to-market insights, and honest stories that will help you scale more wisely and thrive in an increasingly competitive market. Because there is a smarter way to scale, and we're here to uncover it. Today's guest is Natasha Ratanshi-Stein, a founder who's seen startups from almost every angle. Natasha founded Surfboard after scaling customer service operations at Bulb and seeing firsthand how broken legacy workforce management really was. She then went on to scale Surfboard from spreadsheets to product market fit, through the messy middle, and ultimately to an acquisition by Dialpad. In today's conversation, we get into what founders consistently underestimate on the journey from early traction to real scale, and the dangers of hiring sales too early, to the realities of product market fit and building a go-to-market motion that actually holds up. If you're navigating the 1 to 10 million stage, wrestling with founder-led sales, or trying to graduate to the next level without losing momentum, this episode is packed with hard-won, honest insights. So, Natasha, welcome to Making the Grade. How are you today?
Very well, thank you. Thank you for having me. How are you doing?
I'm really well. Yeah, I'm really excited to have you on the show. So thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
So I'd love to just start with your journey. You founded Surfboard in 2021. You raised capital from firms like Fly Ventures, Seedcamp, Speed Invest. I know you came into this having spent time at Goldman Sachs, then in VC and in operations at Bulb. So you've seen the startup world from different vantage points. Could you just share more about how Surfboard was born, what that origin story was, and I suppose what that moment or realization was that convinced you that this company had to exist?
Yeah. So when I had left Piton Capital, where I was a VC there, I had this itch to become an operator. And so I thought, I want to be on the other side of the table. I want to feel the fast feedback loops. I don't want to be at arm's length anymore. I want to be in the weeds, in the action. And so I joined Bulb in 2019, I believe, as chief of staff. And at the time, Bulb was the fastest growing company in the UK. It had just passed 1 million domestic homes served. It was opening business. It was opening international. There's a lot of stuff happening there, and it felt like a very good home to make that transition from being a VC to an operator. And so while at Bulb, while it was easy to jump into tasks like securing financing. So one thing I worked on was raising a debt facility because of the previous experience I had in VC, but also at Goldman Sachs. What I really wanted to get into was much more of the gritty stuff of being in a company. And that's where I encountered the challenge that was customer service scaling. And so Bulb being a utility, and specifically a retail utility that serves domestic households, scaling customer service was something that was imperative to its success for a number of reasons. Apart from price, people choose their energy supplier based on which ones pick up the phones or respond to emails fastest. Number two is that you have a lot of third-party companies that rate your quality of customer service. So be it Citizens Advice in the UK or Which, those were constantly on a quarterly basis ranking how each energy company was providing service to its customers. And the third thing, probably most imperatively to us, was that it is a heavily regulated industry. And so if customer service flops, the regulator's on your back, threatening fines because you're not picking up phones quick enough, or you're not responding to emails quick enough, or you're not offering channels like chat, which consumers find much more convenient. And so that's how, in my role of chief of staff, I ended up getting helicoptered to the customer service function to help scale this function. And apart from the quality of service, the other constraint we had was the cost of service. So being an energy retailer, you're operating at 5% margins because there's so many pass-through costs, be it wholesale costs, being network costs, being it regulation costs. And so with margins that thin, the best way to survive is by making sure that your OpEx is as optimized as possible. And so that's where I went into this realizing, okay, we can't just hire our way out of this problem and throw bodies at it the way other industries might be able to do with a bit more lacks. And so it really comes down to making sure that we're hyper optimized on making the best use of what we have. And so that's when I started to realize that what we didn't have was the right number of people working on the right things at the right time. And so an example of that is that on a Monday morning, you'd walk in, you'd see the phone wait times might be 45 minutes, which obviously makes customers pretty angry. And then you'd see people working on fixing bills or something, which is a very important task, but probably not the most important thing to be doing when you have a 45-minute wait time. And that wasn't at all something where people just chose not to do phones or whatever. It was that that direction wasn't provided to them in making sure the team was as optimized as possible. And so being an ex-investment banker and VC, the first thing I resorted to was, okay, let's build spreadsheets to try to solve this problem. And very quickly realized that the static nature of spreadsheets was quite prohibitive in managing how dynamic customer service is. That's when I realized we need software for this. I went out to procure software, and most of the workforce management industry, which is the industry that Surfboard operated in, was extremely antiquated. And so you were looking at a couple of companies that were publicly listed. You were looking at a lot of companies that were private equity backed that started in the 90s. Their biggest USP at this point was were cloud based. And so you're kind of like, all right, I'm in 2020, or sorry, maybe like 2019 at this point, and cloud-based just doesn't cut it when Salesforce had evolved that industry almost a decade earlier. And so out of lack of choice, we ended up implementing one of these PE-backed companies that was at scale but extremely legacy. And that was a really painful process for us for a number of reasons. I went away thinking someone has got to build this in a much better and much more relevant way for today's customer service team. I wasn't really sure that person was going to be me, but as the pandemic hit and I had more time to reflect and you started to see customer service enter a new wave where you have all of those complexities I just described that means the software isn't fit for purpose. And now you've got customer service teams that are remote. It really felt like the timing and the why now was super, super clear. And so I decided to just jump in with both feet and start the company in 2021, as you say.
Wow. Firstly, I love that this was born out of a personal pain point that you clearly saw and recognized that that pain point was being underserved by the legacy providers. But what gave you that conviction that I suppose you could do this, having not been a founder before, that you could embark on this journey? Where did you get that belief from?
I would say I never had that belief. So my parents are entrepreneurs, and having seen their journey and the ups and downs of it, I would say I almost vowed to myself I never wanted to go through that myself. And so, working at places like Goldman, working at places like Piton Capital, even going to Bulb, that was a relatively late stage company, I was really always taking the safe route. And so I didn't have this urge to jump into being an entrepreneur. I had this urge to see the problem fixed. And I think when I saw the problem wasn't getting fixed and someone had to fix it, I guess I just had to back myself and jump in, but the imposter complex was there at the beginning. The imposter complex lasted throughout the journey. I would say I even look today at the journey, and I'm very pleased with the outcome of how Surfboard evolved and ultimately got acquired by Dialpad. But I'm like, whew, I can't believe I did that. So I'm glad I did. But I don't know. I think most entrepreneurs would say that every day they wake up being like, can I really do this? And I certainly felt that every day.
Well, good for you for feeling the fear and doing it anyway. And I'd love to just explore that journey and how it evolved. So, can you just give us that kind of, I suppose, key sequence of events as to how that business Surfboard evolved up until the point that it was acquired?
Yeah, so I would say in my last few months at Bulb, I had a very good relationship with the founders at Bulb, and I had told them, look, I have this idea, I'm thinking of doing it. They had obviously experienced the pain point themselves, and so they were very supportive. Both of them ultimately ended up angel investing in Surfboard as well. But what I had the advantage of is that in my role at Bulb, it was advantageous for me to speak to as many other companies as possible to understand how they were overcoming this problem. So we spent time with companies like Monzo, Deliveroo, Nubank. We even went to Swansea to see the DVLA's customer service team and see how they were doing workforce management. And so that was really helpful, I think, in covering the user research and validating this wasn't just a problem that was specific to Bulb, it was a problem that was specific to all customer service teams at scale. And so I left Bulb around November 2020, probably took a couple of weeks off, and then immediately just started jumping into putting together early prototypes and seeing what the early MVP would look like for workforce management that was built for the modern age. In January 2020, we ended up closing a pre-seed round with Fly Ventures and Seed Camp and a number of angels, a lot of people who I'd worked with previously at Bulb, at Piton, I knew from Goldman, etc. That was fortunate timing, being a time when fundraising was just, you were able to do it really quick. So I'd say the end-to-end process of raising that pre-seed round was probably like 2 weeks from conversations to term sheet, and then, a little bit more on legals. But by that time, it was on cruise control. I was a solo founder. And so what that meant was that I had a bit of a circular reference to break of having a product, having a team, and having capital. Back then, raising for B2B SaaS it was a good time for that. I ended up breaking the circular reference by raising capital first. And then the next thing I did was what I believed was in my control. So I took early prototypes, which, like, to be honest, I had built on slides. Like, I didn't even know how to use tools like Figma at the time. And just started speaking to the companies that I had done user research with and started pre-selling this concept. And so they bought into the concept. And so what I ended up doing was creating a design partner program. And I didn't really know who our ideal customer profile was at the time. So I was like, hey, let's basically get 10 design partner customers who have different construct of their customer service team. And so we ended up being able to sign those design partners relatively quickly. We did that on a 4-year contract with staggered pricing, where the first year was pretty much nominal, and then it would start moving towards a 50% discount to list, and then a 25% discount to list, and then having them at full pricing. And that was pretty helpful for giving us the validation that this product can sell if it's built properly. It ended up giving our investors validation that there's a market out there, and the path of getting in and capturing that market is there. But what we ultimately have to do is build this product that we're promising. And so that's when we went out to hire a team, or I went out to hire a team. And the first hire I made was a data scientist who could basically take a customer's historical data, start building the forecasts, and start building an optimization model that would optimize who of their people needs to be doing what at what time in order to meet their service level agreement and customer service. We then hired an engineering team. And so by October 2021, we started building the front end of what we had already had on spreadsheets and slides, and released that probably by January 2022. Our first release was a flop. So that was pretty disheartening, because I was like, hey, a lot of people are really excited about what we can do in disrupting this legacy industry of workforce management software. We just really haven't delivered on it. And so that's when we brought on a couple designers, and they did quite extensive user research to really understand how that could be made better, how it could be made more dynamic, how we could focus on the biggest problems customer service teams have. And then we realized there was a big challenge around shift planning. So it's the specific hours that people work. So we built the shift planning tool. And so people were like, yeah, this is like really useful to us, but like, you're charging us $30 a seat, and other shift planning tools are $5 a seat. And so that was something where we were like, hey, we're getting a little bit closer, but we're still pretty far off what we need to be delivering in this industry, and especially the capabilities that these behemoth products that we're trying to disrupt can offer. And so we were really very much thinking in the agile framework or methodology of like, how do you build a scooter before you build a car? But anytime we would iterate on this, it just felt like we weren't quite hitting the mark. And so I would say a key inflection point of the Surfboard journey, and I'm trying to remember the time, it was probably like end of 2022, beginning of 2023, was when we brought on our head of product, Sagar, who was someone who I had worked with at Bulb, and really rated him for pragmatism, getting product shipped fast, being very good at speaking to customers. And so he joined at that time. And that's when we just started seeing the momentum on the product side shift dramatically. So I would say by May 2023, that's when I felt like we had a good product on the ground. We had product market fit. The design partners and all the new customers that we started acquiring were finally like, okay, yes, this is what I'm looking for. We were able to win customers who were using competitive products, not just ones who were paying nothing for spreadsheets or not using any tool at all. And so that's when it felt like the rubber had hit the road, and it was about momentum, and less so the product build phase, but matching the product build phase to the go-to-market phase, and where things for me felt a lot more exciting.
Gosh, there's so much to unpack in that, Natasha. I don't quite know where to start. But well, firstly, I just love that you didn't try and build the product before getting those design partners on board and actually commercializing. I think it's been great that you went to them with with spreadsheets and a slide deck and got them committed to 4-year deals, which is awesome. But given the fact that you kind of didn't really release what they were hoping for to start with, did you have to renegotiate those deals? I'm interested. Or did you stick them on the original commercials that you had them on for those 4 years?
We didn't end up renegotiating those deals. I think because of the guilt, but also the imposter syndrome that I was facing. There were times where I'd be like, "Okay, let's, like, waive the payment for the next 6 months because we realized we just aren't hitting the mark." And I think what was really important to me is using the intrinsic relationships we had with those customers to make sure we were buying and preserving as much goodwill as possible. I think what I would say the 2 lessons are, number 1, upfront, when a customer is interested in the market that you're disrupting and wants to be part of that journey of disrupting the market with you, it's a fantastic opportunity to agree to, like, a 4-year contract, payment terms, et cetera, upfront. Even, like, we probably could have gone bolder on upfront payment, which I learned later down the road in, like, 2023. But I think one can be a lot bolder than they think they can at that point where everything is a dream that you're delivering on the dream together. The second thing I learned is, like, the importance of goodwill with the customers is that as much as people are buying into the vision of the industry, customers are buying into the vision of you as a founder, the mission and the values of your company, and you don't wanna lose that in the early journey. And I think one thing that this podcast is all about is how things change when you're pre-product market fit and when you're post-product market fit. And pre-product market fit, that relationship is the most important currency that you have. And so that was something we really leaned into quite deeply.
Yeah, I love that. That's definitely such an important point, that goodwill. But yeah, I love that you stuck to your guns to a degree with those design partners as well. Although you might have given them a bit of a period of grace. But it sounds like you successfully went from like pre-product market fit to post-product market fit, and then you were kind of in that go-to-market fit scaling. From your perspective, what do you think founders often underestimate when scaling from that kind of early traction, where they've got a few of those design partners or maybe, customers that have signed because of a relationship or a network that you've got, to then actually, scaling meaningfully on that journey to kind of maybe 10 million? What do you think founders underestimate when on that journey?
I think they underestimate how much, and I'm gonna just use crude numbers right now. The first million is dependent on who the founder is and the relationship the founder has developed. So I think, the term founder-led sales is often used. And I would say one thing about the hubris of the tech industry and when you raise venture funding is that there's an assumption that you can scale prematurely or that you are at scale and post product market fit a lot earlier than you are. And I would say that a lot of founders think that those initial relationship builds are validation of product market fit. I think there's certainly validation of problem market fit, but in order to begin that scaling journey, you really have to have a lot of other raw ingredients under your belt. And I think by those raw ingredients, I mean, you have to be able to successfully displace a competitor who's at full price and not undercut them on pricing. You have to be able to sell without the founder promising an infinite roadmap and feature requests that you might not already have. You have to be able to have the case studies or the social validation or social proof that others have implemented and seen value and gotten an ROI quite successfully. You really have to know the ROI of the product because you cannot pass selling software to another salesperson who's not the founder without being able to articulate and calculate that ROI very quickly. And so, what I would say that we were certainly guilty of and fell into the trap of was hiring other people to sell very early because we had capital. So we were like, why wouldn't we do this? We'll be able to scale much faster. But ultimately, I would say those early hires in sales probably ended up slowing us down more than they could speed us up in the absence of being able to have that real true product market fit, which I would say probably came at like as we were approaching our first million.
Yeah. I think you make such an important point there. And I see it all the time with founders that we support in terms of almost wanting to outsource or delegate that problem to the professional salespeople too early, often, especially when they're non-commercial founders, they're technical or engineering founders. And as you say, I think it slows progress towards product market fit because actually to achieve product market fit, there's there's a certain internalization and cross-functional collaboration that needs to happen from market feedback to product team to messaging, positioning, you name it. There's so much iteration and pivoting that's needed there. And if you get some quota-carrying salespeople that are kind of coin operated, that are just out trying to sell your products, you're not going to get that feedback loop closed, I don't think. When do you think it's right to actually hire salespeople? When do you think it's right to move from that founder-led selling? Is there a inflection point or a certain revenue or number of customers? What do you think is the right time?
There's probably the numerical quantification and there's the intrinsic quantification. And so to start off with the numerical quantification, I would probably say that you have reached the target average contract value that you think you can go for at that stage. The reason I say that is that one thing we found was that when we brought in salespeople, they were great at selling, a 5K ACB, but we were targeting a 30K ACB, which meant I still had to be across all 30K ACBs, and the 5Ks were just a distraction for the product team. The second thing I would say is that return on investment is clear, which I mentioned earlier, and they're able to regurgitate that return on investment that other customers had experienced very fluently. The third thing I would say that is intrinsic is that they really understand the ideal customer profile. And that's not just the ACV, but the characteristics, the tech stack, the problems that they're facing, the metrics that you're optimizing. And that works quite well. I would say, just on the numerical targets, I think we probably were ready for a salesperson when we had hit 30 to 40 customers. I think that was proof that there was a repeatable motion in place. I think the other thing with that 30 to 40, which was interesting in our journey, is like we had hit 100K ARR like 3 times because we had billed them, but then we were like, actually the product's not ready. We're going to cancel this. And then you'd see that in the absence of them actually paying, they were like, okay, yeah, forget it. We'll come back when you're ready. Or this just isn't right for us. And so that was probably quite like a reality check for us, as the third time we hit 100K ARR. And we're like, is this for real? Or are we going to be able to hockey stick from there? And so I think the other thing on the numerical targets when you're then able to build out a team is that you've got to have customers willing to pay up front. And it's not just a signed contract, but it's money in bank as well. I advise a number of companies now. And one thing that in the early stages I see is that you see this gap between the committed ARR and the actual build ARR. And I think when you see that gap, it's like, hey, there isn't product market fit yet. The product still has to reach a few more milestones before that's bridged.
Yeah, such good points. And I think you're right. There is no one size fits all around when to transition out of founder-led selling. It is some of those key proof points that you're picking up and triangulating that give you that sense, okay, well, we've got some pull from the market. It feels like, we can actually create a repeatable process and maybe a playbook for those reps to come in and own. So I loved how you're thinking about it. Now, I know every startup journey has its rough patches. It sounds like you've learned a few lessons along the way, but what were some of the biggest roadblocks that you hit when scaling Surfboard, whether that's operationally, culturally, or even product wise? And how did you navigate those?
That time of starting a company, so 2021, was a very interesting stage in the life cycle of a startup. I think it was when companies were flushed with capital. Nobody saw raising capital as a challenge, and they felt like the valuation and the direction of the company could go in only one direction. And not many companies had hit that reality check of there are going to be roadblocks, you are going to stumble, things could go in the other direction. And so even in those experiences of us hitting 100K 3 times, which I found extremely demoralizing, I'm not sure that was felt across the team because it was like, oh, well, capital's a flush. Like, we're going to keep getting paid. Nothing's going to change for us. And so you as a founder end up going through a very lonely journey of you being the only one to realize how much of a disappointment and a failure that is. And so I would say that that is just a lesson for all founders, whether you're in 2021 or 2025, of just back yourself. If you feel like there's a cultural problem where people aren't feeling the urgency, you've got to change it. I do think at every phase, like pre-product market fit, post-product market fit, reaching your first million, expanding past that first million, building out a proper go-to-market function, you've really got to evaluate every team member and just ask yourself the question, are they still the right team member for this journey? There is, of course, a lot of gratitude towards the employees who got you to the stage.
You touch on such an important point there around, yeah, I suppose not everyone is going to be right for different phases of that journey as well. So the team that gets you from 0 to 1 might not be the one that gets you from 1 to 10 and beyond. But You also call out the importance of spotting that early. How do you think founders can spot and how can they diagnose whether that team member is ready for that next phase of the journey or not?
I think every founder knows it. They're just too scared to act. And so it's really acting on that intuition much earlier than they otherwise would. I would say most founders wait for something potentially to go wrong before they act. But I would say what they don't focus on is the effect of collective thinking or the contagion of that way of thinking, where somebody might not be doing anything wrong. They might be doing the job to the best of their ability. They might be doing the job well, but are they doing the job in a way that enables the mental model of the company to evolve from 0 to 1 to 1 to 10 or 1 to 10 to 10 to 100? And if they're not, they're bringing the entire company backwards to the first stage. And so, I mean, I've got a 15-month-old son, and every time, like, he can walk, and every time I see him crawl, I'm like, "What are you doing? You can walk. Like, stop crawling." And I think that analogy fits quite well with how a company operates. Of the company can now walk, but you have certain people who gravitate it back towards crawling.
It's a great analogy. I love that. Let's talk a little bit about the acquisition by Dialpad. You were acquired in 2024, so relatively quick journey to acquisition, which is awesome. Maybe you could walk us through how the acquisition came about. What initiated those conversations? What did the process actually look like from a founder point of view?
Yeah, so interestingly, we had an SDR who was using a prospecting tool for cold outbound. And with that, I would say that he had a criteria on the prospecting tool that was people who work at a contact center. And so that ended up going to thousands and thousands of people. And then he ended up reaching out to the director of product for contact center at Dialpad, trying to sell Surfboard to them, but obviously they're not relevant. And so this guy, Fabrice, who I now work very closely with, responded being like, "Hey, I might not be the right person to be a customer of your software, but I'd love to chat." And he didn't end up getting a response. And then so Fabrice messaged me directly on LinkedIn saying, "Hey, I got a message from one of your salespeople. I think it was a mistake, but I would love to chat about integrating your workforce management software with Dialpad." And I was like, "Oh, this is actually great because I have been pitching to a lot of customers who use Dialpad, and we don't currently integrate with Dialpads. We've had to disqualify them quickly, but let's chat." And so Fabrice brought the chief product officer of Dialpad, Vincent, on the call as well. And I was like, "Well, this feels like overkill for like a whatever, like initial demo." But it was really helpful. And I think what we had learned were a couple things. And so we were quite enthusiastic about integrating with them. We had gone into a bit of a deep dive around that. And then I think like maybe end of June, it was a Saturday, and the chief product officer emailed me saying, "Hey, can we speak today or tomorrow?" And I was like, I don't think he wants to talk on a Saturday or Sunday about APIs. And like, I don't think he's in the weeds on the APIs anyway, nor am I. And so I took the call, and he just said, "Look, at Dialpad, we've been around for 14 years now. One thing that's really important for us is owning the full stack." The Dialpad team was a spinoff from Google, and they had seen the success of Google owning the full stack and how much Google was able to move forward based on full control over every aspect that was important to its software stack. And so he just asked, he was like, "Look, I'm very happy to continue the dialogue on this integration and the partnership, but is there any chance you'd be interested in being acquired?" And I responded with, "Look, our revenue growth is on a great trajectory. We would probably be gearing up to a fundraise, and like this was like in June. So I was saying Q1, Q2 next year. We've got ample runway. I think at that point we still had 22 months of runway. So there's by no means like any reason for us to consider an acquisition. And so it would have to be, I guess, like, I'm interested in hearing your terms. Like, it has to be on the right terms for me. It has to be on the right terms for our investors. And then obviously the integration of the team, et cetera, is also something that's important to me." And then the CPO says, like, "We're based in California. We met you in person. Let me come visit and see you." And at this point, I hadn't yet told him, because there was no reason to tell him, that I was 8 months pregnant. But now he's seeing me in person. So I'm like, "Okay, let's chat about the elephant in the room. I'm also giving birth next month. So if you want this to happen, it has to happen within a month. We have not been considering an acquisition. So we are not running a process. I am not going to run a process being 8 months pregnant. So either we get this done on terms we both agree with, or like, let's pens down, because this is a waste of time because I'm giving birth in a month's time." And so I think what that was probably quite advantageous around is that neither party was horsing around because time was of the essence. And so we got to a term sheet that we could both agree to pretty quickly. And then post term sheet, I would say everything was relatively easy on the dialogue between us and Dialpad. Obviously, there was the journey of bringing our VCs on board. The target or the estimated due date of my son was August 31st. My son, and that was also the date that we expected to close the transaction. My son ended up being born on August 25th. And so that ended up pushing things back a bit because there were certain reps and warranties we hadn't yet finalized. And so we ended up closing September 6th, which all things considered wasn't too much of a lag. But obviously there were 3 days or so where I was in the hospital and completely out of action. But yeah, it was a very quick transaction, mostly driven by, I think, circumstances that I don't think every founder would be able to capitalize on necessarily.
There's nothing like a compelling event to drive like focus and an outcome like that. And I just love the fact that it started off with bad profiling by your SDR. Like we're always giving advice to our clients, like have a really tight ICP, know who those personas are, make sure you're targeting the right personas. And the fact that your SDR targeted someone that led to an acquisition is amazing. I love that. And I suppose just on a personal level, how have you found that transition from being a kind of founder of a early stage startup to now being a part of a much larger organization? Yeah, how's that been for you?
Pros and cons. I would say the first pro is that as a founder, you spend most of your time on three things: making sure you don't run out of money and the finances, which is relatively boring, if you may, but extremely urgent; selling. And so you're always trying to make sure that the next level of customer you're going for, you're across every conversation on and directly selling. And then HR related topics, which are also in many cases not very enjoyable. And so the nice thing about being acquired is that all of those are taken off your plate. I probably miss the selling aspect of it because it's how I feel most connected to the customer. It's how I feel most validated in what we're building. It's where you get that, like, oh, wow, like this product could really solve a lot of things for me reaction. Where when you're not on the front line selling, you don't get that gratification as much. I would say the hardest thing transitioning from a founder to being acquired and part of a much larger organization is the loss of control and urgency you're able to drive through the organization. And so one thing Dialpad's extremely culturally aligned with me on is they're like, anything you see or you want to do, just get it done. There's no red tape. And it's really nice that they say that, but you are looking at an organization of over 1,000 people. So while there might be no formal red tape, you certainly have to cut through a lot of layers and figure out how to get things done where things are never going to move as fast as they would have previously. And you can't just like rip up the organization and say, actually, you know what? I'm going to set this marketing campaign myself, which I would have previously done. So I think that loss of control is a very big adjustment. And I would say for the first 6 months, I felt relatively lost not having that because control was something that I hadn't yet really seeded prior to the acquisition. So this really forced my hand quite quickly and acutely.
That makes sense. And yeah, I know a few founders that have been through that exit and integration process now, and that loss of control is always the biggest thing that hits them. So, just suppose just turning back to that journey where you were scaling Surfboard, and a big part of this podcast is about scaling lessons, and in particular around go to market. So, when you were on that journey with Surfboard, how did you move from that kind of early revenue, often unpredictable, to building that more repeatable, predictable go-to-market motion? And in particular, were there any structures or processes or metrics that you deployed that proved to be really successful and essential for you, I suppose?
Yeah, I would say the first thing is product market fit within the right ICP. And so when we were serving these like 5 to 10K size customers, we had product market fit with them, but it wasn't the right ICP. So when you do the math of how to get to a million, 3 million, 9 million ARR with that, it just doesn't add up unless you really are throwing a lot of bodies at it or your product led growth, which this type of software isn't typically. And so I think at the point we had reached the ability to serve and sell to a 30K contract easily, displace them from another tool and migrate them within 2 weeks. That was certainly evidence for me that we were on the right track and in the scaling journey. The second thing around team structure and headcount is that we had gone through 3 iterations of different heads of sales. It was a bit of like a Goldilocks phenomenon where one of them didn't have enough B2B experience, one of them was too scrappy and not structured enough, and the third one was too structured and not scrappy enough. And then I ultimately, in between and after each one, got back involved. And what we ended up finding at the point it was really working was we had a very, very good BDR, and we had a very, very good AE. And those were just, it's really hard for me to define what made them really good. But aside from being culture fits, they had the right hustle, they had the right organization, they could learn how to demo the product very quickly. They were independent thinking enough, but knew how to lean on me where they could. It was just miles different from other iterations of those roles that we had previously. And so I would say that team structure gave me a lot of confidence that even without the Dialpad acquisition, I could have gone on mat leave and sales would have continued. We could have added another $1 million on mat leave, and I would have had full confidence in the ability to do that. And then the third thing is the product's ability to deliver on continuously increasing that ACV and moving towards harder and harder customers to serve. And so one thing that I feel very strongly of is that you should never feel fully confident in your product's ability to serve who you're going for. And I would expect, even if you're Salesforce and you're selling to, a Google, you're like, oh, this is a stretch. There's certain things we've got to build for them. And so I really felt that we should always be stretching ourselves and our product's ability to serve larger and more complex customers, but going towards that because that's where the need is the highest.
Yeah, when you touch on a few really important points there. Firstly, that kind of increasing your average deal size so it becomes incrementally easier to, achieve higher revenue numbers. But that's not easy in practice sometimes because often, as you say, there's a product component, but there's also a kind of go-to-market and a kind of enterprise selling component to that. Were there any key lessons that you learned, or what advice would you give to other founders that are looking to transition from a smaller ACV to a larger one?
I would say it's always better to hire people who have come from a slightly larger ACV, not substantially larger, who can do this. And so one thing I felt about having a successful sales team in place is our AE specifically was probably used to selling like 100 to 150K contracts. And now you're bringing him to selling 30K contracts. And what I really liked was that he put pressure on the product team to make it possible for higher and higher ACVs because he just saw that as the most efficient way for him to hit quota. And I really felt a huge burden taken off me when he was starting to implement that pressure on the team, which I would say previously wasn't felt. And we had a lot of people who just wanted to sell 5K, 7K ACVs because they were addicted to the quick hit, but it wasn't helping us move the needle enough. I would also say that the difficulty came from a little bit of engineering culture that needed to be overcome. And I think this is also where it comes back to my previous point on constantly adapting the team and making sure it's a stream, not a pond. And I would say that ACV journey is a good example of where it needs to be a stream and that you need engineering to also intrinsically feel the pressure to be shifting the goalposts frequently. And what you don't want is you don't want a pond where it's like, okay, we've built for this 30K ACV or we've built for this 10K ACV. Now let's focus on platform resilience and the type of stuff that engineering enjoys doing. Like, I think the boundaries have to consistently feel pushed internally with engineering. And I think where I was quite lucky is that it can be hard to get engineering to agree to that. I think you have layers of roles like engineering managers, et cetera, who it can be difficult to convince to change their mindset around pushing the boundaries and delivering on a lot of customer commits. And they feel like it's just too much fragility in the roadmap and want a bit more stability. But Sagar, our head of product, we shifted engineering to reporting to him. And that's a bit unconventional. Engineers don't typically like it because they want to report to other engineers. But I would say in aligning engineering outcomes to commercial outcomes, that was a really big success factor to avoid siloed thinking, which I was worried was starting to emerge.
It's great. I love that you did that. And as you say, not a lot of people do, and engineers don't like it. But I think you definitely get that connective tissue better between product and commercial. And you mentioned just now that one of the kind of lessons or challenges was about sales leader hiring, and it sounds like you did the thing that we hear all the time, which is just not quite hiring the right profile based on where you're at, your stage, the problems that need solving, and and it can be devastating for some businesses. It really sets them back a lot of time. Do you remember when you hired your first sales leader? And if so, like, what were the key considerations behind that hire at the time?
Yeah, our first sales leader joined in December 2022. I think what I really liked and what I was really attracted to that specific profile was that they had been a previous founder. And I was very much like, again, using like a cliche word, I want someone in founder mode coming in and acting the way I do, making decisions, treating everything with urgency the way I do. I would say the difficulty around is having a previous founder can go very well, I think. It can also go pretty badly because it can be a culture clash where you spend, in my case, almost 2 years cultivating this culture within the organization. And they come in with a radically different approach, wanting that control that I discussed potentially missing post acquisition, and it just not meshing well. So I would say I spent a disproportionate amount of my time on that like HR culture issue of trying to mesh the two cultures together. I would say the other thing was, and the example I gave you with the specific first sales leader was that their experience was very much B2C driven, but also like SMB B2B driven, where it's very reliant on like field sales at scale, tons of capital thrown at the problem. And that was just very different from selling on an ROI, a higher ACV, a slightly longer sales cycle in SaaS, and displacing a different set of competitors. So I would say that the learning curve for them to understand how to sell this type of SaaS specifically, but also the cultural elements made that one difficult. But yeah, that was end of 2022. So we were probably like in our second year of operation.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, that familiarity with that go to market motion and in particular deal size and complexity is one of, I think, the most important things to get right with the sales leader. We see too many startups and scale ups over indexing on things like industry experience, or maybe looking for someone that's kind of got the black book. But actually, having that direct experience of whether it be field sales, inside sales at a similar ACV, and complexity is one of the most important things. But you then went from a founder to what type of sales leader after that?
We ended up promoting someone internally who was previously in ops, kind of like a business operations associate manager at Surfboard. And what I found with that individual is that in the early days of Surfboard, they very much embodied the DNA of the company. And so they were willing to do any type of work. They were willing to jump on it any hour. They were excellent with customers. You could bring them onto sales calls. They could exude the charisma that I felt I was able to exude in sales calls. And so I felt like they were a bit of like a mini me and able to represent Surfboard the way I was. And if I felt like everything was reliant on founder led sales, then maybe the next best thing is to have someone who kind of acts and talks like me who is able to do it. I think what they were less experienced in was the management of other salespeople. And so it was especially around performance issues, upskilling, even things like Medic and the sales frameworks that are so obvious to many people, they didn't have that. And so I think while they had an enormous degree of will, it's not that they weren't skilled, but they just didn't have the experience in selling or managing a sales team previously. And so while everything was learned through osmosis and a little bit organic, a little bit more of that structure was needed. And I would say that was a shame because that person was a really good asset to the company. Probably more so like a 0 to 1 asset. I would say we were now on the 1 to 10 journey, which was a different kettle of fish and the challenges of the company. But I also think that putting them in this role that was extremely high stakes, extremely visible, was a bit of a binary result where either it's going to result well or they're not going to work out with the company. And it ended up being the latter because they weren't quite ready for this role that I was putting them in. So we then overcorrected from number 1 to 2 and found someone with B2B experience. Actually, one of our VCs had found them for us. B2B experience, was a sales director at a blue chip company that I had a huge degree of admiration of. Started in the UK, expanded to the US, grew to hundreds of millions of ARR, went public, and then got bought out by a private equity fund. The dream of what you want your company to ultimately look.
Oh, I know where this is going, Natasha. You don't need to say anymore.
I think what I didn't know about, I guess, the sales director role specifically is that at a company like that, they've got 10 layers below them and 10 layers above them. And so you do get in wanting to see that leadership, which they've never done before, but then you also want them to be on the ground selling, hustling, which they haven't done in a long time. And so that ended up not working out. And so then I would say it came back to me. And then the Goldilocks was having a really, really good AE who was able to run things on their own.
Oh gosh. And how many sales leaders was that? So it was three, but in what space of time did you have those three sales
So the
leaders?
first one was December 2022. The final one joined in around September, October 2023 and left in December 2023.
Wow. So you had three sales leaders in the space of a year.
Yeah.
That's a record. That's a record for me.
From now. Don't want to be a record keeper on that.
Oh gosh. I suppose just like kind of wrapping up the show now. I mean, I could spend so much more time with you, Natasha. I've got so many more questions I'd love to dive into. But I think, this show is all about, I suppose, the challenges that a lot of startups face in terms of graduating between funding rounds. And that really has declined in recent years, unless you're an AI native startup that's going from 1 to 10 in like 12 months, and then you're raising the next round within another 3 months. But what we've seen, certainly, since COVID, is that graduation rate between C to A and in particular A to B has really dropped off. I would love to get your thoughts on what do you think would need to happen to increase that graduation rate?
I would say the internal one is that it's a little bit around what I said previously. If a company almost has to reinvent itself at each milestone. So the way I typically thought of it was like the first million, and then 1 to 3 million, and then 3 to 9 million, and then 9 to 20 million. We obviously never reached that number, but I think that's at the point you've got to reevaluate your product, you've got to reevaluate your processes, and you've got to reevaluate your team. And in many cases, the best thing to do is rip it up and start again. You might have a couple of people who carry the culture and have a lot of domain knowledge, and their historical context around that is beneficial. But I would say that you've also got to, it's a double-sided coin. You've got to evaluate those individuals of, are they going to take us forward to the next stage, or are they going to hold us back? I'd say globally, but specifically in Europe, investors have got to be less fickle and less zeitgeisty on specific trends or industries. When I was in VC, there was a craze around e-scooters. There was a craze around blockchain. There was a craze around those like quick delivery companies. And you saw disproportionate amounts of capital go into whatever the zeitgeist was. Today it's AI, and I think AI has a lot more fundamentals that are in line with a boom in funding compared to e-scooters or quick commerce or even blockchain. But what you can expect to see is that, in 40 years, I would say every company is going to be AI enabled. But does that mean every company is going to be an AI company? Absolutely not. And so I think that where this comes to that graduation rate between companies getting from Series A to Series B or Series B to Series C is that a lot of the failure rate is because the company might have very strong fundamentals. It might have a clear trajectory to how it becomes a 100 million business. But if it's not in an industry that VCs are attached to because it's not part of the zeitgeist, then it just can't raise at the valuation it wants to raise at, or it might not be able to raise at all, period. And then instead of going through that VC journey, it either goes straight to private equity or growth investor, or it ultimately ends up exiting. And I think that's something that Europe is extremely catastrophic around, and where I would urge there to be the biggest change.
Well, Natasha, I think that's a very good place to end. And I completely agree with you. That zeitgeisty is too impactful, I think. And as you say, I think there's a lot of really well-run scaling startups that could reach 100 million, but don't necessarily have the backing or the belief from VCs because it's not the in thing at that moment in time. So yeah, Natasha, this has been a fantastic conversation. Yeah, I've really, really enjoyed it. You've taken us from the early spreadsheets at Bulb and the real pain points that you were facing that led to then the creation and the scaling of Surfboard. And what an incredible journey that was, getting acquired so quickly by Dialpad. And I love the compelling event of your pregnancy that led to it happening so quickly. I'm sure there's founders listening that will walk away with some great ideas and perhaps a fresh sense of what's possible when you combine kind of the operating rigor that you've clearly got with a founder drive. So thank you so much for sharing your story, your lessons, and your candid reflections. It's been a real privilege having you on.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great speaking to you.
No problem at all. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Likewise.
Thank you so much for listening to Making the Grade. We really hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you have any questions following this episode, or you'd like to recommend a guest perhaps for our next season, please let us know at podcast@scalewise.com. And if you did enjoy today's episode, please do consider leaving us a review on either Apple Podcasts or Spotify. We'd really appreciate that. As this is a brand new show, reviews really help us spread the word and reach new listeners. Plus, we'd also love to hear what you're enjoying about our show. Thank you so much for your support, and see you soon for another episode of Making the Grade.